Morning, church. Nice to see you all this morning. Glad that you're well. Is everyone well? If you look around this morning, you'll see quite a few that might be missing. I know that myself that there is a few that are unwell. I know there's a few away. But if you can look around and see that there's someone that should be there that's not there, make sure you give them a call this week and say, hey, we missed you. And check on them and see how they are. They'll enjoy your call, I'm sure. Today we're going to be looking at, the title is, But Now. Does that make sense? No. That wasn't quite a resounding no. You know, I was very warmed by a comment I had from Neville this morning. He goes, I see your title, but now, he said, that must come from Romans 3 and verse 21. And I said, yes. So someone's done some pre-reading. How many people have pre-read this week Romans chapter 3? Excellent. We have some people. We had more than last time. So, we can pre-read the last section of it because Joseph next week is going to finish off the last section of chapter 3. There was some stuff in there that I couldn't really quite grasp myself, so I've handed it to Joseph, and he's going to be able to explain it to us really well. So I'm looking forward to that, Joseph. But today, we're looking at Romans chapter 3. You know, in Romans chapter 3, we have what I would call three main transitional phases in the chapter. Three main transitional phases. The first one comes in the very first verse. It says, what advantage then has the Jew? This is a transition from chapter 2. What advantage? What then? And then we get to verse 9, which is what then? Before we get to verse 21, which says, but now. And we look at this word, but now, we're going to find that this is the most transitional phase in this chapter. And it's going to go from something that's heading down a path of hopelessness to a path of hope and joy. So I want to make sure that we get to that verse today. But before we begin, I want to share a story with you about a camp that I took the Casino Church on out up into Kyogle, up to the dam there. I think Lismore has been on a camp up there as well. And when we went up there, I was one of the last people to leave because I was helping clean up and do all those things. And as I was driving out that dirt road on the Sunday after having a great weekend, all of a sudden, my tyre got pierced with a sharp rock in the side of the wall of the tyre, and a tyre went down. So I pulled over to the road and I thought, yep, I've fixed tyres before, no problem at all. And someone come past just then, this was probably the last person out of the camp, and they said, oh, are you okay? I said, yeah, no, it's all good. I've got a spare in the boot. Everything's fine. You go your way. It'll only take me a short. You sure? You sure? Yeah, no, go. You're right. I'm fine. I don't need help. Anyway, they went. I started. Took the tyre off, put it out, got the one from the boot, put it in, put the other one back away, and as I let the jack down, I realised something that made my heart sink. That tyre was flat also. Here I had sent the last person away, and I'm on this lonely dirt stretch of road, and my phone was flat and I couldn't call anybody. And here I was with no help. Did I need help? Did I realise I needed help? Not initially. Not until I found out. Why do I tell that story? I tell that story because what Paul does in Romans is get people to see that they're in a bad state and they need help. And people are not prepared to listen, just like I wasn't prepared to listen until we realise that we're in this state and need help. So as we look through Romans, we're going to see in these three transitional stages of Romans that Paul is trying to get them to a point of saying, you're in a hopeless position, but I do have a solution for you. And I'm going to be very excited to share that solution, because that solution for me was like a weight lifted off my shoulders when I understood what Paul was saying. So, But just to try and help us to understand, I want us to go back and remember the main points of what we've learnt so far, because I notice there's some people here that haven't been on this journey of Romans with us, and so I just want to help you to understand like what Romans is actually saying. First of all, we find that Paul introduces himself as a slave. He introduces himself as a slave of a crucified Messiah. Now that for a Roman world is really odd, because their Messiah died, and yet you're a slave of a Messiah that has died. But later on Paul says that he is not ashamed of that fact. He's actually proud of that fact, because in it is the power unto salvation. And so he introduces this topic of salvation by faith, and he realizes that him being a slave of a crucified Messiah is power. It's certainly for the Romans an upside down power, but it is power in this crucified Messiah. We find then, after Paul introduces that he goes on to share in the last part of chapter 1 that there was an exchange that took place. There was a number of changes and exchange. He says there in verse of chapter 1, in verse 22, it says, professing to be wise, they became fools, and they changed the glory of an incorruptible God into an image made like a corruptible man. So the first thing that they did wrong was they changed the image of God into something corruptible that man had made. So they made this exchange, and Paul took them back to creation, showing this exchange that took place. Later on, he tells us that they exchanged in verse 25 there, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, reminding us of that first lie. And then later on in verse 25 of chapter 1, it says that they actually changed what was natural for the unnatural. And so there's this exchange that takes place, which leads them on a path of idolatry. And Paul mentions the sins in the end of chapter 1 there, and it's pretty bad, the sins that are presented. And you can just imagine the Jews of the Roman church, when they hear that, they're going, oh yeah, they're pretty bad. But then Paul turns around in chapter 2 and he says, you who judge another are just as bad as them. You on your moral high ground that think you're pretty good, you're not so good. And so Paul then introduces how they are actually on the same level. That would have been pretty hard for them to take. Pretty hard for them to see that they were no better than their Gentiles. Now we need to remind ourselves of what was happening in the Roman church of that time. It wasn't like a big church, it was a lot of house groups at that time. But we remember that the emperor of the time, the Emperor Claudius, he had actually expelled the Jews in 49 AD. So the Jews sort of left those little church groups and had to go back to their own areas. But later on, when Nero came, probably around 5 or 6 years later, he actually invited them back. And when the Jews came back into this church, into their house groups and church groups, there was a bit of dissension amongst those church groups, because the Jews were trying to get them back to some of the Jewish practices which they had sort of forgotten about and gone on. They were sort of running their churches how they had been taught. Now, Paul didn't set up the Church of Rome. Paul didn't set it up, but Paul had certainly heard some of this stuff happening. And Paul was trying to help this church, and he wrote them a letter. He shared how he longed to come to them, but he also shared some of the things that was going on in the church of that day. And the Jews were putting themselves above the Gentiles, not only in their churches, but also in their communities. And Paul was revealing to them that they are no better because of their judgment and because they haven't themselves kept the law very well themselves. And so we have this idolatry that leads to immorality, and the path that goes, and he reveals that. And chapter 3 begins with this word. What advantage then has the Jew? What advantage? Let's have a look in Romans chapter 3 and verse 1. What advantage then has the Jew, or what is the profit of circumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. And that's basically where we left off a couple of weeks ago. And here we have this change. What advantage then? Like if the Jew is just as bad as the Gentiles, then what's the point of it all? You know, the interesting thing is that chapter 2 begins with this really, it appears to be broken up. Is jumping from here to here and back to here and back to there. And it's like Paul is nearly confused. And some scholars are going, it's like Paul was just sort of walking along and talking to his scribe and saying, yeah, and mention this to them. And mention this, and mention this. But you know, when we look into what Paul is writing here, it's a really well-constructed path. And chapter 3 actually begins with 4 objections. 4 objections to what he had actually just said. He'd just sort of taken them down a path that they were very uncomfortable on, and although he didn't know them, he knew about them, and he can just imagine what they're going to come back at him with. At this time, Paul had been doing ministry for around 15 or 20 years, but remember where Paul came from. Paul came from a path, a pharisaical path of pursuing holiness through the law until his eyes were opened. Well, I should say until his eyes were blinded and then reopened on the road to Damascus. And here Paul has a complete change, and so here he gives these objections, these 4 objections, because it's basically like what Paul is saying. I know what you're going to say to what I've just said, and I've got all the answers. The reason I've got all the answers is because I've been ministering to you people for a long time, and not only that, I was a Pharisee myself. So if we can just imagine these objectives that Paul talks about in Romans 3, we would actually see Paul as a Pharisee debating Paul as a Christian. When we put ourselves in that mindset, we see that this is a really well-constructed passage that Paul is actually already combating their arguments before they've even given them to them. And so the first objection is, well, what advantage then is the Jew? What advantage has the Jew if he's just as bad as the Gentile? And Paul says, much in every way. Much in every way. Not so. God continues to bless his people. What about the Jews? Because they've been like this, does it mean that God is not going to finish through? And he says, no, that's not the case. Then in verse 3 he says, with his second objection, for what if some do not believe? Will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? In other words, what if we've got this group of people here that do not believe? Is that going to make the faithfulness of God without effect? What does he say? Certainly not. Indeed, let God be true and every man a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you are judged. Here we find in this second objection that Paul is saying just because you have been unfaithful, it doesn't mean that God won't be unfaithful. And the interesting thing that Paul does here is that Paul quotes from Psalms 51. How many people know what Psalms 51 is? Psalms 51 is David's confession of his sin with Bathsheba. You know, when that sin was brought to David, David wouldn't accept it for a start. And you could see probably how he wouldn't accept it, because that was an acceptable thing that he had done amongst kings. That was his right as a king to take somebody else as wife. But God showed him that it was sin, and he didn't accept it for a start, but eventually he accepted it, and then he wrote what Paul is quoting here, saying that, yes, God, your judgment is correct. Even though mine wasn't correct, you still remained correct and true. Even though I wasn't faithful, you remained faithful. What about the next objection? Let's have a look. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates, this is in verse 5, but if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? You know, the interesting that Paul also says here, I speak as a man. In other words, it's like Paul is embarrassed to say what he's saying, but he knows that this is an objection that could come up. And so he says, but what if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God? What shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? In human wickedness brings God's justice and righteousness into view, then isn't his wrath against sinners a contradiction? That's an objection that could have come up. And this is something that Paul deals with. Because our sin has helped to reveal the righteousness of God, how can God be wrathful against that? This is basically what Paul is saying. He's saying certainly not. He can't be seen as just if he allows evil to continue. And so he says that's not even an objection, but I'm speaking as a man because I don't even believe that myself. And then next time he says, for if the truth of God has increased through my lie to his glory, why am I also judged as a sinner? And why not say, let us do evil that good may come, as we are slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say their condemnation is just. What's happening in this fourth objection? Paul is dealing with this notion of cheap grace. When you will actually hear it today, whenever you talk about the fact that we are saved by grace alone, people start to get worried. Well, what do you do with the law? How does that fit in? And there was accusing Paul of the same thing. Well, what about this cheap grace? You know, if you do that, then why not say, let us do evil that good may come? What's the point of being good if God's just going to give us grace and help us to get over it all? And if our doing evil helps to reveal the righteousness of God, why not let's do evil that good may come of it? And what does he say? Their justness will come to its condemnation. You know, I often wondered whether Peter was actually talking about this in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15 and 16, because Peter says, and consider that the long-suffering of our Lord is salvation, as also our beloved brother Paul, according to the wisdom given to him, has written to you, as also in all his epistles, speaking in them of these things, in which some things are hard to understand, which untaught and unstable people twist to their own destruction, as they do also to the rest of the Scriptures. Peter here recognised that Paul's writings were hard to understand. Peter here recognised that Paul was sometimes misunderstood, but also misquoted because people were following the own dictates of their own heart. And they were actually trying to say, look, that's cheap grace. That's not who God is. But Paul reveals that that is not the case. So what do we conclude then? Verse 9 starts with, what then? What then? After Paul has silenced these objections that could come up, he then says, so what's the conclusion of it? And he goes on to say, are we better than they? Not at all. For we have previously charged both Jews and Gentiles are all under sin. And then Paul, what he does here is he actually quotes 6 passages from the Old Testament scriptures. He quotes from Psalms, he quotes from Ecclesiastes, and he quotes from Isaiah. Basically telling us the sinfulness of the Jews as well as the Gentiles, reaffirming what he's already said in chapter 2. There is none righteous, not one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They have all become unprofitable. You know, I like this word unprofitable. I looked it up and I realised that this word unprofitable is a word that's sometimes used for sour milk. It's gone off. It's no good anymore. Basically telling us the state of our sinful selves. Not a good picture, is it? How are you feeling about yourself? Feeling pretty good? You're not like that though, are you? Remember in chapter 2 he talks about those who put themselves on a moral higher standing than everybody else. And they are just as bad. He goes on to say in verse 13, their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they have practiced deceit. The poison of asp is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear before their eyes. This word fear represents that there is no respect of God. There is no being in awe and respect of God anymore in their eyes. Not a pretty picture. Is he speaking to the Jews about that? Well, he's actually quoting Old Testament scripture who was speaking to the Jews. So he's putting them on that same level as we saw the Gentiles beforehand. They were totally depraved. What Paul is revealing here is the universality of sin. And if we were to put ourselves in the same boat, we're at the same level as everybody else. You're not quite as good as you think you are. But you say, well, I come to church each week. And I ring those that are missing and make sure they're all right. And I keep the Sabbath day holy. And yeah, well, that's the state you are. We get to verse 19. And in verse 19 it says, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. What's happening here? He's speaking again to the Jews. They're the ones who are under the law. And he's saying that every mouth may be stopped. The law speaks to those that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. What the law reveals is that we are all guilty. There's no way out. You know, this reminds me of a time many years ago. This is way back in my younger days. I've reformed from my younger days, and I'm a bit ashamed of some of it. But this reminds me of a time that I was standing before a judge down in Taree Court. as I was driving to Sydney one time, I had come across this guy that was travelling at 80 kilometres an hour in a 100 zone. And I went to overtake him and someone was coming and I had to come back and I sat fairly close to him and then he put his brake lights on and I got a little bit annoyed and I stayed there. What I didn't realise that person that I was doing that was a sergeant of police. And a little while later, I got pulled over and said that I was driving on a cancelled licence, but I said, "Here it is, officer." And he said, "No, this was cancelled." And I said, "How long ago?" And he said, 2 years ago. I was in a bit of trouble. And so I realised I better get myself a solicitor because later on we got notice that I had to attend court. And so I looked up solicitors in Taree and I got myself a solicitor, and my brother who was travelling with me, he actually come down and helped. And this solicitor didn't seem to be really good. And my brother said to him, "You need to take this path and you need to take this path." And he go, "Oh, yeah, no, that sounds good. We'll present that." And on the morning of confronting the judge, my solicitor's standing up and he's telling all these good things about me, and I'm going, "Whoa, yeah, I'm going to be right here. He's putting me in a pretty good light. I've been doing this and I've been doing that." And then my solicitor said, "And what's more, he's never been up on this charge before." By the way, this charge that he was talking about was a charge that could probably land me up in jail if the judge wanted to be nasty. But he says he's never been like that. He's been pretty good. And then the judge pulled up a bit of paper. And let me tell you, this bit of paper was quite long. And he said to my solicitor, he says, "Have you seen this? Have you seen this?" I started to remember back at some of the silly things that I did as a young boy with a licence. And I thought to myself, I'm finished. I looked at my solicitor and I said, "Come on, give him some answers back." And he goes, I'm talking about that particular charge. I'm not." And then he realised he better just shut up. When it says here that every mouth may be stopped before God, God's law reveals that we are all guilty and we haven't got anything to say. From that point on, we realised that we had nothing to say for that judge. I could be put in as much good light as possible that I did this in the community and that and everything else, but it didn't account for my record. My record was pretty bad. And this is the point that Paul is trying to get us to see that we've got a problem, that we are sinful and we have no hope on our own. And verse 20 reveals there, "By the deeds of the law no flesh will be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin." There was nothing that I could do at this point to make myself presentable before that judge. I was guilty as charged. And I had to rest on what he decided. What it reveals is the law. We cannot be justified by our good deeds of law keeping. But by the law is the knowledge of sin. So what does the law point to? What is the law doing here? The law is revealing that we're not up to scratch. The law is revealing that, hey, I've got a problem that I can't fix by law keeping. And that's why I love these next two words. That's why I love these next two words. But now. But now. This is like a real transition piece in this scripture. But now. But now. These are one of the two most beautiful words that Paul has spoken so far in this passage. The point that Paul has left his readers to is in a helpless, hopeless condition. And then he reveals, but now. But now. But now I have some good news for you. But now. The righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. Here he begins with, but now there is a righteousness of God that is apart from the law. And it's witnessed by the law and the prophets. In other words, you can go to your law, and what you see in that law, that there is a righteousness that is revealed, and it is apart from the law. It goes on to say in verse 22, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ to all and on all who believe, for there is no difference. This righteousness of God is through faith in who? Let me try that again. This righteousness of God is through faith in Jesus Christ. Why Jesus Christ? Because he came down to this world to reveal God's righteousness in taking upon himself the punishment that we deserve. You know, I remember I'd not long started ministry. I'd come back to God. And one of the things that kept me away from God for many years of my life was the fact that I just wasn't good enough for God to love me. I did come to an understanding that God loved me regardless. But in that loving me regardless of who I was still trying to earn his love. And I remember being down at, I think it was one of my first ministers' meetings down at Stewart's Point, and I was staying in the caravan and I was just studying this passage at the time. And I remember reading this righteousness of God that is apart from the law. The righteousness that comes through faith in Jesus Christ. And when we look at this righteousness yes, it is the righteous character of God. We looked at this because basically it's where Paul started in Romans chapter 1 verses 16. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and then for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. So yes, God's righteousness is revealed in that act of him making us justified before God. We noticed in verse 20 that by the deeds of the law no flesh will be justified. No flesh will be made right by the deeds of the law, but hey, there is another way to be made right before God. And it's through the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And you know, when I was studying that passage and I was thinking about it, and I was reading verse 24, and it says, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. You know, I got that. It actually felt like a weight was lifting off my shoulders, literally. I go, wow. Why am I making this so hard? Why am I making this all about my deeds, my goodness? Why am I not just accepting what Christ has done for me? You know, it's one of the things that I believe that the devil attacks many of us on, is that we have something to do with us making ourselves justified before God. But what Paul is telling us here, there is nothing that we can do. It's through the righteousness of God. What this does reveal is his righteous character. And it also reveals the righteous standing which he gives us through the sacrifice of Jesus. It's a righteous activity which comes from God. And it is a gift. It is a gift. And it's a gift that tells us, for all have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. I've done a sermon on this glory of God before, because what is the glory of God? You know, when I first remember seeing the glory of God, I would look at it and go, yeah, that's because he's shining and he's bright and he's beautiful and he's wonderful. But this glory of God is his character. And I want to suggest to you that we fall short because of our sin. We fall short in two ways of the glory of God. What do we fall short of? What did verse 18 say? Verse 18 says, there is no fear of God before their eyes. There is no respect or being in awe of God. Why? Because they don't understand his true character. See, when I got a greater concept of God's character and his love and his commitment to me and his love for me and how perfect he was, how just he was, how faithful he was, I started to be drawn to that. And in being drawn to that, guess what happens? I want to reflect that character more within myself. And that's what Paul is mentioning in Romans chapter 1. He says, when he says that it's the power of God unto salvation. When we get a concept of the glory of God, the character of God, his goodness, his righteousness, and we reveal what he has put in place for us to be justified and made right before God, we will be drawn to that. But not only that, it will change who we are. There's power in that. There's power in that. For all have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. I want to suggest that we fall short in those two ways. We fall short of understanding it, which makes us fall short of reflecting it. When we understand it, we will better be able to reflect it in others. How can we be not forgiving of others when we have been forgiven so much? How can we hold grudges against others when God is not holding that against us? How can we treat somebody like that when God has not treated us like that? When we get a picture of God's glory, we will better reflect his glory. You know, later on Paul is going to say, then do we nullify the law because of all this? He's going to say, certainly not. And Joseph's going to reveal more stuff on that later. And we will also reveal more stuff on that because that goes right through into chapter 5 and verse 21. This subject that we've opened up today, the righteousness of God. But the picture I want us to leave with today is a picture that God has done something beautiful for us. That we are in a state of hopelessness and helplessness. But through what God has done through Jesus for you and for me, it brings us back into a right relationship with him. This chapter began with what advantage is there to being a Jew? We started Paul on his objections that the Jewish people might say to what he's already said. And he said there's much in every way. What then? Well, we're all in this state of helplessness, of hopelessness. But now there is help. But now there is hope. Because God has made a better future for us through Jesus. May you get that picture of what Jesus has done for you. May it change and reorientate your life. And may it help us to better reflect the glory of God to others. Thank you. I invite you to stand as we close. Dear Father in heaven, I just want to thank you again for Jesus. I want to thank you for his sacrifice, for his righteousness, that he has made us to be back in a right standing with you. May we understand the significance of that. May we be drawn to you, and may we better reflect your glory to others as we each go our separate ways today, is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.